into the church today and receive them into membership, I would just want to say a little bit more about the church today, about what the church is and about what God has called us to be. And I want to use 3 Greek words that the Bible uses to describe what the church should be. Now, I don't use Greek very often. You haven't heard me do that much. But I had a year of Greek at college and a year at seminary, and I paid for those classes. So, I got to use it, right? So I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to mention the 3 words that I think are important as to what the church needs to be. But getting there first, I want to read a little parable that a friend of mine wrote. He wrote a book called Parables from Life, and then a couple years later, another one, More Parables from Life. And there's a short one here that he called When the Birds Formed a Church. A group of birds decided to form a church. So they called a meeting, and the duck stood up and said, "I think we ought to require baptism by immersion. That way we can get their purses and billfolds wet." The rooster said, "No, I think we should baptize by sprinkling. Many people dislike the embarrassment of getting wet all over." So the argument was on, and the parrot said, "I don't think baptism is that important. What we need is a good program, because everyone knows you can't have a good church without a good program." Then the mockingbird said, "What about the choir? And don't forget the organ." "No," said the thrush, "we don't need an organ. They're much too expensive. Piano is much better." But the titmouse didn't want any musical instrument in the building at all. And the sparrow said, "It would be just as well if we threw music out altogether." And the goose said, "What we really need is a preacher who's good with young people. If we don't attract the young people, other churches in town will gobble them up." But the starling thought that it was more important that the preacher be a good mixer. And the blue jay figured out that if the preacher would lay off sin and stuff like that, then maybe almost anybody would do. But the real wrangle came over the budget. Some thought everybody should tithe if they were able. Others thought they should just do away with offerings and operate on faith. Finally, the wise old owl arose and smoothed his feathers, and everyone drew quiet, because they knew he had great wisdom. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "all these things are secondary. I'll tell you what we need. What we need is sincerity." "Yes, sir." He repeated it, quite pleased with himself. "Above all things, we must be sincere, whether we mean it or not." So they formed a church, and it was for the birds. But when you hear people talk about the church must be this and the church must do this, the problem with that always is, who is the church? Well, it's every one of you. It's you. When you say something about the church must do this, yeah, I guess you better. It's every one of us. We all make up the church. And I think the New Testament says a great deal about the church, about the kind of church we need to be, about what God would call us to be. And as I said, there's 3 words I just want to mention quickly this morning before we close here. One, a Greek word that some of you have probably heard if you've been Bible study students, is the word kerygma, which means to proclaim or to preach. Now, a lot of you think, well, that leaves you out, that's not what you're called to do. But to proclaim the message isn't just standing up here doing what I'm doing, is it? You proclaim the message when you stand around that flagpole at the high school and pray. You proclaim that message at work when you're supporting somebody who's just lost a loved one. You proclaim that message with your family when the family comes and on holidays and on weekends, and you make church a priority and you bring them here. You're proclaiming something about your faith. There's a lot of ways that we need to do that. We do it by our spirit, we do it by our joy, we do it by our testimony. We do it in so many ways, and we need to proclaim that message of Christ's saving grace. And another word that you probably have heard more than any of the rest of these is koinonia, which simply means fellowship. I love somebody's definition of fellowship when they said just a bunch of fellas in the same ship. And there's something to that maybe. There's a kind of a dipstick to measure that by, I think, from Ephesians chapter 4 when it says, "Stop being bad-tempered, angry, quarreling, harsh words, disliking others. Instead, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving, just as God has forgiven you, because you belong to Christ." You probably know the name Rick Warren. He said that fellowship in most churches is simply stale cookies, bad coffee, and talking about absolutely nothing. Well, the biblical definition, the model you see, of course, is more than that, isn't it? It's about telling somebody else in the congregation about your fears. It's about sharing with somebody else about their pains. It's about encouraging somebody else. It's about crying with somebody else. It's about hugging somebody else. It's about supporting somebody else in any way that you can. It's that connection of brothers and sisters together. That's so much more than stale cookies, bad coffee, and talking about absolutely nothing. And I think we do a pretty good job with that. Obviously, they've got a ways to go, but I think we do a pretty good job with that. And you've been in churches where it just feels kind of cold. You're on vacation maybe, and you go into a church, and things just feel cold. Nobody is really sharing, and nobody's really talking, and everybody seems kind of independent. And you should have been tipped off when the ushers came down on ice skates. But sometimes, it's just that cold feeling, and I think we do much better than that here. And I love it when I hear from visitors and guests about how welcome they felt and about the warmth that they felt. And I think we do a pretty good job of that. But we need to keep on it and do better, don't we? The fellowship here, forgiven, forgotten, forever. And one other word is that word diakonos, which simply means service. It's what you do after you said to God, "I love you." How do you serve? What do you do? There's an opportunity for everybody here. Our council came up with a list of all the ministries of this church. It was an amazing list. There's all kinds of things that we're involved in. And there's something for everybody. There's something for everybody to be involved in. Like an advertisement I saw about a dude ranch. It said they had horses for everybody. If you're thin, they had thin horses. If you're fat, they had fat horses. If you're fast, they have fast horses. If you're an experienced rider, they had experienced horses. If you've never ridden, they've got horses that have never been ridden before. So they got something for everybody. Something for everybody that's there. And I think this church offers you some way to serve for everybody that's here. Some way to plug in. To show the world a reason for living and a hope for dying by our witness and our testimony. Robert Coleman was one of my great mentors in life. He was a professor at Asbury Seminary. We spent some time together. I had an early morning prayer time with him and a few other guys at 6 o'clock that I still very much treasure in my heart and in my mind. He told a story about an artist who was commissioned to paint a picture of the church. And he painted what he thought represented the church. And he looked at it, and the more he looked at it, the more he wasn't pleased with it, and he tore it up and started over again. And this time he painted it, and it looked almost identical. It was a tempest out on the sea, this raging waves and this rushing wind, and there was pieces of a ship floating there and bodies in the water. And there was one guy that was clutching onto a big rock. And the difference from the first picture and the second picture, on the first picture, this guy was clutching onto the rock with both hands. On the second picture, he was clutching onto the rock with one hand and reaching down into the water to grab somebody else with the other hand. That's how he described the church. Holding on to our faith, holding on to Christ, holding on to the church with that one hand, while with the other hand we're reaching back down into the water to find somebody else to pull back up to safety with us. That kind of outreach, that kind of love, that kind of ministry that we need to be. So that's the church that I want Abby and Braden to come into. That's the church I want all of us to be. And there's so much more we could say, and there's so much more we could add. We need to be a loving church, and we need to be a praying church, and we need to be a forgiving church, and we need to be a church that's sending people out in mission service. And I think how we find out where we need to be in that picture is just in our own prayer time, in our own quiet time with the Lord. When the Spirit speaks to you and tells you where you fit into all this, where you are the church in all this, where you need to respond to His Spirit in all of this. May that be so in all of our lives this week. In His name I pray. Amen. And may the ushers come forward to receive our morning offering.